Hello and welcome to the Canny Climate Dialogues podcast, the podcast at the intersection of international education and climate action. Today's episode is a live recording as a part of Canny Climate Action Week, and my name is Kelly Davis. I'm one of the podcast co-hosts, but our Canny co-host today is going to be Antonio Gutierrez, and the topic of discussion is climate justice, but we're going to hear more details on the topic when I pass it off to Antonio, and I promise just a couple of minutes. This is Canny Climate Action Week. Hopefully you've been to some of the other sessions that have been happening this week. There have been a number since Monday, and the last session is going to be the Europe chapter meeting, which is happening tomorrow on Friday at 10:30 a.m. Central European Time. We've had sessions on the Canny Accord, getting started in your international offices, a number of regional chapter meetings, and also another live podcast. So it's been a lot of really exciting stuff, and we're looking forward to really kind of wrapping up some of these sessions with a lot of energy today. So I want to go ahead and say thank you to the Canny Climate Action Week sponsor, Altia Global Cooperative, a worker cooperative providing consulting services to decarbonize international education by focusing on equity-centered climate action. Services include professional development training on climate justice, emissions assessment of your international operations, communication, messaging, and policy writing support, and other projects as needed. And of course, they're proud signatories of the Canny Accord. Their website is altea.global. That's ALETHEA.global, and we'll link to it in the website in the show notes. And as always, listeners of this podcast will know we are very grateful to the University of Auckland in New Zealand for being a Canny Climate Dialogues podcast sponsor. They've been sponsoring us since just after the beginning of this podcast, and we're super grateful to have them continuing to support us today. I have one quick final announcement, and that's if you are looking for a way to get involved in making the Canny Climate Dialogues, we're having a working group meeting on May 2nd. In fact, we're actually having two meetings. One is happening at 8 a.m. Central European Time, or at 4 p.m. If you're based in Sydney, Australia. So that's meeting number one. And then a second meeting, still on May 2nd, but at 8 a.m. Pacific Time and 5 p.m. Central European Time. If you're listening to this and it is after May 2nd, you can email us at info@canny.org to learn more about how to get involved. And so that's all of the announcements I have. I promised it was just going to be a couple of minutes. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Antonio. Antonio, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Kelly, for that nice introduction. Today, I'm very honored to be hosting this podcast with two incredible thought leaders in international education that are Samia Chasi and Savo Heleta. Let me introduce them a little bit for you. Samia is a practitioner, researcher, and facilitator in higher education internationalization with more than 20 years of experience. Her research interests are critical internationalization and global and South perspectives on higher education, with a particular focus on decolonization and South-North partnerships. She's also, probably most importantly, mother of two teenage boys. So good luck with that, Samia. Savo is a researcher, internationalization scholar, and practitioner with more than 10 years of experience in higher education. His research interests include internationalization of higher education, decolonization of knowledge, climate justice, and social justice advocacy and activism. Savo is also a survivor of the Bosnian War in the 90s and author of Not My Turn to Die, Memoirs of a Broken Childhood in Bosnia. At the moment, he's working as a researcher and internationalization specialist at Durban University of Technology. So welcome both. I am so happy to have you here in the podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And thank you.
So we have a couple of questions that that became classics in this podcast. So first, Samia and Savo, where are you joining us from?
Well, I'm joining you this afternoon from Johannesburg in South Africa. It's absolutely wonderful to be with you. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our chat.
I'm joining from Dubai, United Arab Emirates. I've lived in South Africa for about 14 years, and for about past 2 years, I've moved to the Middle East. in the desert. And I think it's quite linked, very interesting for this topic of, rising temperatures and how we're going to make it in the world. We're waiting for the summer here, so we're waiting for that it's coming kind of to the rest of the world.
Yes, it's going to be a big challenge indeed. We'll get into that very soon. First, let me ask you again, so both of you, we ask this to all our guests, and we would like to know, what is your climate story? Why are you here in a Canny podcast?
Perhaps I give this the first stab. I don't think there is a single climate story for me. I think there are a few storylines, if we can call them that, in my life that are connected to climate, and perhaps I can just briefly touch on three of them. The first one is that as a practitioner in international higher education, I've become increasingly aware of my own contribution to climate degradation, particularly in the context of short-term mobility and short-term travel that we often engage in the context of our international activities. And this is what our podcast focuses on, so I'm not going to go too much into the detail at this point. The second one, Antonio, you mentioned that I'm a mom, and you gave away that my children are teenagers. And I think that's also a very important aspect for me, because I'm concerned about equipping my children with the relevant knowledge and skills that will hopefully allow them to live long and productive and fulfilled lives. And as part of that, I am really concerned about the legacy that I'm leaving behind for them as a parent. And, climate destruction, the destruction of our planet, I think is really at the top of my mind in that context as well. And the last one, Savo spoke about his location. I am joining you from South Africa, where I live. We are at the moment experiencing an acute energy crisis. We've had daily power cuts for many months in a row. According to today's schedule of our load shedding, we don't have power in my house and in my neighborhood for 9.5 hours out of our 24-hour day. And you can imagine that severely impacts our ability to work and our mental well-being and our physical well-being, actually. And interestingly, at a cabinet meeting yesterday, our newly appointed electricity minister presented a proposal that includes the extension of the life by delaying the decommissioning of our coal-fired power stations. And that, of course, is in some conflict to South Africa's commitment towards clean energy transition. So, the climate is literally all around us and is a very, very hot topic that concerns all of us, I think, in different levels and in different ways.
A few things from my side. I think, so I'm from Bosnia. My parents moved from the city. Well, for the most part of the year, they moved from the city and live on a family farm where they grow food, and it's beautiful. It's amazing where they are in the mountains. But either going there or speaking to my parents, over the last 5-10 years, we've noticed massive changes when it comes to the weather patterns and the way that things are changing so quickly and so dramatically. So that's kind of like a personal, another personal connection and kind of like a climate story is living in South Africa and experiencing years of, again, changing weather patterns and droughts, and, living in a city that has, 1.4 million people and doesn't have water. And there is really, it's very difficult to plan the future in a place like that, because simply there is no water, because the weather patterns are completely changed, and there's nothing that it can be still predicted. And I think the third one that led me to a lot of research on climate has been I've done a lot of work and a lot of research in my studies around conflict analysis, conflict studies, conflict management, and thinking about conflict, and also thinking about my own experience in conflict and struggles to survive when you live without water, electricity, and a lot of things for years. And considering the fact that, over the next 20 to 30 years, millions and hundreds of millions of people are expected to be displaced due to climate change, and also the conflict that will happen because people are displaced and fighting over limited resources. Thinking about my own survival and struggles in the war and what is coming in the world has led me to think about and consider this, what we're talking about here. And it has also led me to the area where I work and where Samia and I work, to think about specifically internationalization and what we are doing, what we could be doing differently, and the critical questions we have to ask about ourselves and our work.
Thank you both for sharing your climate stories. I am so excited for this conversation. So let's just dive right in. The first question I have for you, and let's say, Samia, we'll start with you. Today's episode takes a name after your latest article. So please tell us a little bit about the intersectionality between climate action and social justice. You were exploring this towards more sustainable, equitable, and just internationalization practice. So tell us a little bit where the idea for that article came from.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to actually, put the spotlight on this article that Savo and I wrote together that was published in November last year. I hope that someone will be able to share the link in the chat. It's actually available as open access, so everybody can read it. I think, as Savo said, one of the things that we have in common is that we, as practitioners and scholars in the field of higher education internationalization, like to look at our own practice critically and like to reflect on the things that we do and that our peers are doing, always with a view to see, to highlight perhaps some of the challenges and start putting our heads together to say, what can we do about certain things? And so one of the things that we had discussed was, a certain discomfort or an uneasiness with this practice of traveling, and particularly traveling to international conferences where, there is kind of like a calendar of events where you go and you spend a couple of days and then you fly back home, and then a couple of months later you're on the plane again, and you're going to another place, but many of the people that you meet are actually the same people that you met a few months earlier, and it's kind of like an annual cycle. And so we felt that this is something that we would like to explore a little bit more. And then we were very fortunate because the Journal of Studies in International Education published a call for a special issue for papers that wanted to address environmental sustainability and internationalization. And so that's the first connection that I'm going to make between internationalization and sustainability. And Savo and I felt that this would actually, provide us with an opportunity to dig deeper into these issues that we had kind of like highlighted and exchanged in a conversation to say, this is something that we would like to tackle. And so we submitted a proposal and it was accepted, and we were allowed to write up a full paper. And this is what we are going to draw on for the discussion today. So I think let me first talk about the link between internationalization and sustainability, and particularly environmental sustainability. Here, I think, linked to what I said at the beginning, we have to realize when we start reflecting on our own practice critically is that we as international education practitioners and scholars make a significant contribution to climate destruction, especially in the context of short-term internationalization mobility activities. And we really look at conferencing, we look at giving guest lectures, we look at recruitment activities and networking activities and things like that. And why is this so problematic is because a lot of this international travel happens by air. So we put a focus on carbon emissions due to air travel in this article, because air travel is one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And that, of course, allows us to look at the carbon footprint of these international events, and in our case, specifically internationalization conferences. The second thing that I want to just briefly touch on, and it's also in the title of our paper, is the issue of equity. And this is something that I think Savo and I will say that we kind of like almost came to in terms of the writing process. The data to some extent, dictated us or invited us to look at this more specifically. And what we found is that the attendance patterns of conferences are really unequal when we look at participants and delegates from the global north and the global south. So there's really an unequal distribution of international opportunities, an unequal flow of mobility. And very often people, institutions, and countries in the global north are dominant in terms of their travel patterns. And so we saw a parallel, if you so will, between inequities that exist in internationalization and in climate change, in terms of the climate change data that we've looked at. And so also when it comes to climate change, there are inequalities and inequities that we have to deal with. So for example, putting this very, very generally, the contribution to climate change and to climate destruction in particular is one that is primarily made by people and institutions that are based in the global north. But the consequences of climate change and climate degradation are primarily felt in the global south. And we looked at some data that was available. And just to illustrate this, I'm just going to share one example. We found an article that noted that 15% of academics globally are responsible for 70% of air travel linked to international conferences. And the majority of these 15% are based in the global north. And so there is a real issue of inequity, inequality that we have to deal with, both in the context of internationalization and sustainability. And that, I think, leads me to the third point that I wanted to mention, and the third adjective that we use in our title, which is just and justice. I think to tackle inequalities, we have to, intrinsically, I think we are invited to think about how can we bring about more just practices, particularly here in internationalization. And we felt that we have to really start by asking ourselves critically, who benefits from the practices that we engage in, who loses out, and how and why is that the case, and what can we do about that? So I think we are concerned with making contributions to bringing about positive change, that hopefully leads to a more sustainable future for all of us. And taking action towards less damaging practices and practices that are more equitable and inclusive in our particular field, in higher education, internationalization. That's what we are passionate about. And that's, I think, what brought us to write this article together. Savo, please come in and add to that.
I think Samia has covered really all of it, but in essence, when we talk about climate change, we have to go back and ask important critical questions. Who caused it? And the data is very clear that the majority of CO2 emissions historically, and we have to look at it historically, have been caused by the countries in the global north. And as Samia has said, contribution from the global south, from the African continent, and from much of the global south historically has been very minimal. Yet it is the people in the global south, in least developed countries in the world, including the island states, that are already experiencing the impact of climate change, the worst impact, and will suffer the most in the years to come. So as we start to think about what do we do and where do we go from now, those are the key questions, because they lead to us to explore where do we go, what do we do? Should somebody pay the price for the damages that they've done to the world and to the people around the world? And the question of reparations come to mind. I guess the world, the powerful countries in the world don't like the term reparations. They like to talk about loss and damage, because it kind of is for them a more kind of more balanced term, but whatever we use, we have to talk about the justice aspect of, somebody has broken the world, somebody has destroyed the climate. What do we do now? Who pays for fixing things? Who pays for the damages that have been committed? So that also leads to the complexities, and intersectionality also leads us to not just, we're not talking just about one issue. A lot of things are interconnected. We have to talk about social, economic, political, geopolitical issues. We have to talk about how different communities around the world are affected. So when we talk about this, we talk about in general when it comes to climate change, but also when it comes to internationalization, who benefits, who doesn't benefit. Very often it is the people in the global south that don't benefit from mobility, for example, as well as the minorities and immigrant communities in the global north. In the same way, those same immigrant and minority communities in the global north are also the worst affected by climate destruction in their communities and in their countries. So we find a lot of these connections, and a lot of scholars who write about this also highlight the fact that we have to look at intersectional factors, issues, and challenges, and also that same way have to look at the big picture when we seek solutions that are just for everybody.
Wow, thank you so much, both of you. That was some strong beginning. I was especially hit there by what Samia said, right? 15 of us, 15% are responsible for 70%, and then how all these conferences and fairs and events all around the world are majorly populated by global North representatives. And this quickly gives me one consequence of this, and it is that we are developing a construct and a culture and a worldview that is completely Eurocentric, because we are the ones that are actually coming to these conferences and developing this knowledge. And this is something that I read in your article too, and that really fascinated me, how this Eurocentric worldview is defining our intellectual and cultural frameworks. So Savo, could you please elaborate a little bit on this?
Yeah, so Eurocentric hegemony, specifically Eurocentric hegemony in knowledge production, Eurocentricity in the curriculum, specifically in the South African higher education, but broadly in African higher education and globally. Those are areas where I do a lot of research, and basically, so the modern world system, the modern higher education system around the world has been spread, is heavily linked to colonization and the spread of the European educational model and European worldviews, which have been spread around the world, in many cases imposed around the world as universal, and the only legitimate way to think about knowledge and to think about what counts as knowledge, what counts as legitimate knowledge. So we also speak about coloniality, because colonialism has ended in many parts of the world in the 50s and the 60s, in South Africa in 1994. And so some people will say, well, colonialism has ended, and so sit down and don't talk about this anymore. But we use the term coloniality to talk about the systems and structures that have been put in place over centuries that have continued the colonial ways of thinking again about the world. And education is key in that. Education is key in the process of developing the minds of young people, not just young people, old people, anybody. And the colonial powers, the European colonial powers, and later on United States as the major neo-colonial power in the world, have taken knowledge and education seriously to continue to impose the Eurocentric or Euro-American centric ideas, knowledges, worldviews, and ways of thinking and knowing about the world as the only as the universal and the only legitimate way of thinking about the world. And we see that everywhere. I mean, you know, I work in South African higher education, and we see that in almost entirely white and Euro-American centric curriculum in a country that is 90% Black, in a country that has supposedly defeated colonialism and apartheid almost 3 decades ago. You know, how is this possible? It's possible through the structures that have been imposed over centuries and that still remain also at universities which are still very white and Eurocentric, where institutional cultures have been imposed, you know, and modeled on those in Britain and Netherlands, the former colonial powers that came and brought those institutional systems. And we also see that, I mean, we talk about climate change. We see that in the past few decades of research and scholarship on climate change, which have been heavily dominated by the scholars and institutions from the global north. If you read the IPCC report on climate change, they are largely white and very Eurocentric, dominated by English language publications, dominated by the scholars from the global north, very often dominated by white men. And even, you know, there's also scholarship on research on climate change in Africa. Something like 95% of funding from international donors for research about climate change in Africa goes to institutions in Europe, North America, and Australia. How is this possible? So the funders of research about climate change are telling us through their actions that there are no scientists who know how to do anything about climate change in Africa on Africa, that only the largely white men can tell us what the problems are and what the solutions are for the African continent. And so this continues again and again and again, and we see that in the curriculum, we see that in international collaboration, we see that in when we try to publish anything, we know that we'll, you know, any journal that we approach in the global north will have, you know, largely white or white and male editorial board, and you know, very often they're going to tell us that what we know is not legitimate, is not relevant, and yeah. So basically, you know, I think I've gone all over the place, but I'm hoping what I'm trying to say makes sense. And these are the things that we have to deal with on institutional levels, on national levels, and we you know, luckily, I think there's a large, not so large, but there's a significant group of people around the world who are fighting for a space to confront and try to dismantle Eurocentric epistemic hegemony in knowledge and higher education. And you know, are we going to be successful? Are we going to win this battle? I don't know. I'm not quite sure because yeah, the so-called beast we have to fight is just too big, and it's taking us all, I think, into destruction globally. But yeah, we have to do what we can to try to tackle this. Samia, you work with me on some of this stuff, so you can come in, please.
Thank you. Just very briefly, if I may, Savo, I think I would perhaps just try and give a little bit of context to what you see in the area that we are discussing today, which is international education and conferencing in particular, and speak to that dominance of European and US American perspectives in internationalization and how they inform the very field, you know, that we are engaged in. And one example that I often refer to is that of student mobility and study abroad. When you work in a university in South Africa, this is one of the areas of internationalization that people mostly say it doesn't work. It's not, it's only always for a select few, because there's only very limited funds that are available to support mobility for South African students to go out, and South African universities find it much easier to receive students. When we now look at the context of internationalization conferences, then very often a component of that is an exhibition, which really often focuses on a study abroad industry. It's all about finding places, finding partners to send students out, delivering services to those students, from health insurance and all kinds of additional services and that are required for these students that are mobile. But when we look at it and we say, where does this demand come from? And we look at this critically, then we realize it's really the needs of US American institutions that are primarily met with this. Because there is a demand for US American students to find study abroad places. That same need and demand does not exist in the South African context. And so we are participating in these practices of going to these exhibitions and conferences. They are very heavily informed and dominated by Global North perspectives. And often practitioners, our colleagues will say, we actually look for research collaboration opportunities, when we go out. We also, of course, look for opportunities to attract international students to come to South Africa. So we will also take out a space very often in exhibitions to say, we want to also showcase what the South African higher education sector has to offer. But then when you look around and you go and you see the size of our stand, you will find that it's probably one of the smallest stands in the exhibition hall. And that, of course, is again informed by the resources that institutions have available to travel, to send people to participate, etc. So ISA, for example, offers an opportunity for South African universities to come along, and to share a booth space. That's a practice that we did for many, many years, to share the financial burden of traveling and actually collectively representing South Africa, and not just one single institution. And so I think these are some of the very practical implications of Savo's outlining the broader context of what it means to operate in a field that is dominated by perspectives from one region or two regions of the globe, rather than a truly global event. And we and many of our colleagues are really trying to work towards changing that.
Can I just come in? And I saw there was a question. There was a question about, what can we do at the institutional level to create more equality in terms of sustainability of higher education? One of the big things, and this is something that I've been kind of telling myself I need to remember to talk about here, is we talk about sustainability globally. We're talking about climate change and how do we ensure that the future generations have somewhere to live, to exist on the planet. But we're also talking about sustainability in higher education. None of this is possible. There is no sustainability when it comes to climate, when it comes to the world we live in, or higher education under capitalism and neoliberalism. Yet we all work at and exist in the institutions and societies that are shaped by and driven by the capitalist and neoliberal principles and demands. And so, you go to any of these bigger internationalization conferences, they are businesses. They are not, the smallest part is the intellectual engagement. It's the most important part. But the biggest part of the big internationalization conferences are the fairs, are the business side of it. And, higher education and internationalization for a very long time have been businesses, have been this, the commodified and commercialized aspects of higher education. Can we even talk about sustainability in higher education or internationalization, where around the world, more than half of academics are on precarious temporary contracts? We're talking about sustainability that we as educators and higher education institutions are supposed to contribute to the world, to future generations. Yet, universities exploit the majority of their staff so they can make profit. So the vice chancellor, I mean, if you see what university presidents in the United States make, and what for example, coaches in American football at universities make, and it's through the profit-driven higher education system, while exploiting the academics, the people who are supposed to teach future generations, yet many of them can't make a living. I mean, we hear about strikes around the world. We had strikes, student protests in South Africa over the years, over these similar issues. We haven't had it from academics, and I'm quite surprised we haven't had it in South Africa. But we need to go back to the basics and ask ourselves whether higher education is fit for purpose. We hear so much about social justice in higher education, yet we don't have social justice at universities. And so I think that there are important critical conversations we must have. We have to talk about higher education and the public good. What is it? I mean, we all write papers and put them behind the paywalls because we have no money for open access. I mean, we do so much in higher education because it's a demand from the system. And so I think we have to do more to challenge and change the system, including the Eurocentric epistemic hegemony that is part of that system globally. And, unless we do that, we are going to just play the neoliberal game in higher education. We're not going to question a lot of important issues and factors that drive, the climate destruction, because we have to survive in the system and get another contract for another year so we can survive. So there's so much we need to talk about, but yeah, these are structural and systemic issues. And yes, I mean, I agree, we shouldn't be using plastic bottles, when we, go with our lives on a daily basis, but that's not going to save the world. Systemic and structural changes will only save the world.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those interventions. I got some goosebumps. I'm not gonna lie to you, and thank you for highlighting that this is a systemic problem. Today we're talking about internationalization, but you touched on the environmental problem, the social justice, the male, the white, the rich perspectives, systems, the ideas, the way we understand our reality. And it is all related. We're talking about a massive systemic problem that you cannot understand just by the little pieces, the environmental piece or the justice piece, the gender piece, and I think it is crucial to incorporate the Global South perspective, because most of the lessons that we need to learn, there will be some new lessons for sure, but most of the lessons were there. We've just managed to forget them with the years, with technology, and with this capitalist and neoliberal speech worldview. So the problem I see here, like you, Savo, is that I think that to incorporate some of these perspectives, it requires making ourselves some incredibly uncomfortable questions. And socially, I don't know if we are ready for this. We are not trained or educated to review our own views. We are educated to defend our views. So this takes me to my next question, and it is that the efforts taken for this system change or towards sustainability, to many feel half-hearted at best. It feels something like putting a bandage when what you have is a massive internal bleeding. So I would like you to explain to us the difference between mitigation policies, which is how we're trying to do today without changing business as usual, and radical change strategies, and if you would have any examples for us. Savo, Samia?
Samia, want to go ahead?
No, I think this is your question.
Oh, okay, sorry, I don't have the list or anything in front of me. Yeah, so, I mean, I've read most of the IPCC reports, and I think we gotta get to a point as people, scholars, researchers, institutions, countries, to where we really truly and fully critically comprehend the problems we're in, and then seek systemic and structural changes. I mean, that includes the way we produce food, what we eat, the way we, the way we manage water, the way we manage mobility of the people around the world, and who can move around and who cannot move around, the way that we manage various resources. I mean, for example, there's a huge drive around the world to go green in terms of energy production, whatever you want to talk about it. But at the same time, the drive by the rich to go green requires minerals to be able to produce and store energy in different ways. Where are you going to get those minerals? You're going to get them in the global south. The damage that is being done to communities and entire countries in the global south is often not reported at all. There's a report by one of the UN agencies about the sacrifice zones. And this is nothing new. This has been happening for many decades. Sacrifice zones where there are parts of the world, primarily in the global south, but also in some parts of the global north, where the people, for example, you have it in the United States, in the southern part where, it's the majority population is African American. So, the companies don't care about people, certain groups of people, so they will damage the environment in those parts of the world or those countries. And so unless we look at all that and then figure out how do we move forward with, development, and whether we can do it, again, we cannot do it under capitalism and neoliberalism. We cannot do it in a way where we think that humans are on Earth to exploit it, and also some humans are on Earth to exploit other humans for their own benefit, as has been the case for many centuries. Unless we change all that, I really honestly don't see where we're going. And there's a quote from Ben Okri. He's a Nigerian author, and it was quite interesting for me in my research on all this. I've been looking for hopeful voices, for hope, because this what we're talking about today is highly negative, because there are so many problems that we're dealing with, and there's so many more problems that are coming. So I've been seeking someone who can tell me, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we survive this? And how do we get some hope in all this? I found, a novelist to give me that hope. And I'm just going to read just 2 sentences from him. And Ben Okri says, there's a time for hope and there's time for realism. But what is needed now is beyond hope and realism. This is a time when we ought to dedicate ourselves to bringing about the greatest shift in human consciousness and the way we live. It is now time for us to be the most creative we have ever been, the most far-sighted, the most practical, the most conscious. And we have to, so he also says the stakes have never been and will never be higher. So what he says is that everything we know about the world and our existence and the way that we treat the planet, the way that we produce, the way that we consume, what we eat, has to change if we are to survive in the next 10, 20, 50 years. And so I think, to go back to your question, how do we do it? How do we do it from, can we do it on an individual level? Or, yes, individual actions are very important, but systemic and structural changes, the way that we produce, consume, what we eat, and how we treat the environment and other people have to change completely. And I believe that, while higher education has been part of the problem, this is where higher education can become a solution. And it will take quite a lot from us, and also us, people who kind of share these views, to convince people who run or drive higher education institutions that this is, there is a new path, that there has to be a new path, that also as universities, we cannot be exploiting people working at the universities, but hoping that, somehow we're going to be seen as the change makers and the institutions that can contribute to sustainability in the world.
Thank you again, Savo, for
Sorry.
that. I absolutely agree, and universities could be that lead-in role and that leading towards that new consciousness that you were speaking about. And I think this is absolutely critical, because, as you say, we need that consciousness shift. And it is true that international education can bring this, as you see, as you experience, as you incorporate a different way of living, understanding, seeing the world, and living reality. So I have two more questions for you. We do not have that much more time, but let me ask you, in your paper, you were writing about more equitable distribution of international education opportunities, right? And Samia, I would like to ask you, what sort of practices could take us there? How could we improve the situation, and what can we do at an individual and an institutional level to get here?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. It feels like a tough task to follow, Savo, because of course that bigger context that we've just looked at can be quite overwhelming and frustrating and perhaps even paralyzing. And I think in the context of this conversation today, as international practitioners and as colleagues, who have expressed or even joined and volunteered for CANI, which is such an important initiative in this space, I think it's also really important for us to reflect jointly on what we can actually do to bring about change. And that change, I think, happens often at individual level, of course, also at institutional and systemic level. I think Savo highlighted quite eloquently, that this is something that we have to be mindful of. But coming back perhaps to the article and to our reflecting on the practice of internationalization conferences, we highlighted, I think, a few questions that we thought we can all ask ourselves, both individually and collectively, to say, can we bring about changes in this context, in this bigger picture that we are talking about? And Savo, you quoted Ben Okri. I'm going to respond with an African proverb that says, if you want to move mountains, you have to start by lifting stones today. If you want to move mountains tomorrow, you have to start by lifting stones today. So I think it's important that we actually go and find these stones, that we can carry, that are manageable and that allow us to take action. And so in the context of conferences, there were a couple of suggestions that we had that both concern the sustainability element of it, but also the equity element. And perhaps I can just briefly touch on some of them. We have often been in contexts, for example, and this is towards the equity angle of it, where at international events, partnership projects are being presented. And they are often partnerships with institutions in the global north, and sometimes there's global south counterparts, but there are no people from the global south representing the project. And so I think we can bring about equity in international opportunities and in conference attendance by, for example, looking at who has the opportunity to go and represent a project and talk about its impact and the opportunity to present their perspectives. There are a couple of other considerations that one can take into account. For example, in our article, we speak about a particular group of people that are referred to as hypermobile elites, both at the academic level and at the professional or administrative level. And these elites really have a special privilege and therefore also a special responsibility to bring about change. And they need to ask questions, am I part of this elite? What does this mean? Can I travel less? Can I travel differently? Can I use different modes of transport? Not air travel, but perhaps go by train. There's this wonderful Travel with Kenny initiative that we referenced. Can I avoid what I would call a single event travel, a single purpose travel? If I go from South Africa to Europe for a one-day event, is that really worthwhile? Can I extend my stay? Can I do other things? Can I avoid traveling altogether? Can I move my engagement into an online or virtual platform? Savo and I in our article certainly advocate for the fact that conferencing should really move towards a virtual and online mode as a standard practice or as a good practice. I think that's also something that Kenny supports. Is it really necessary to have all of these internationalization conferences every year? So many of them. Can we reduce the frequency? Can we have things like joint collaborative efforts where we perhaps host one global conference? And then also people in under-resourced communities and institutions will have perhaps the possibility to extend. So really spreading privilege, extending opportunities beyond the usual suspects to those that come from underrepresented and under-resourced communities and institutions and countries. Those are some of the things I think in which we can create more equitable international engagements. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it for now. One of the points that we also make in our paper is around international education associations and their responsibility. And we specifically look at the three that are the biggest in terms of delegates, that they attract to their international annual events. And that's NAFSA based in the US, EIE in Europe, and API in the Asia Pacific region. And we chose those because they are really the three biggest. One of the things that we highlight is that these associations and other organizations hosting conferences have certain responsibilities to, apply sustainability criteria to this practice, to not only ask questions about the frequency and the location of these events, but everything that has to do with implementation about venues, sustainable venues, catering materials, offsetting carbon footprint initiatives. But one of the things that Savo and I note in our article as an area that we really need to focus on is data gathering and transparency and reporting on a carbon footprint of a particular event. So we, for example, found that we did not have the data that would have allowed us to model in any meaningful way what the actual carbon footprint of one of those internationalization conferences is, because that data is not available publicly, and it's sometimes not even being shared because it's business confidential. And so we say, reporting on this data and a certain increased level of transparency will be important so that people can make much more informed choices as to whether it's actually useful for them to go and participate in these events. I was at a recent event that was hosted here in South Africa with big delegations from the United States and also from other regions on the continent. And I asked them, if we were able to actually quantify the damage that we have caused to the environment by traveling here, would we still have thought that this gathering was worth it? And I think those are some of the questions, Savo. I think you said, they can be uncomfortable conversations, they can be perhaps painful choices. But I think we agreed and put that forward for others to reflect that this is work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Samia. Beautifully put. So we are running out of time. It's 5 to 6, at least in Central European time. So I want to finish with 2 questions. One that I will put out to our audience, and I will encourage them to write to us through Kenny's social media. So for you, I ask, how do we reconcile our privileges and work requirements with our desire to fight climate change? And personally, I would like you to ask yourself the questions: what sort of sacrifices are you willing to take? Are you willing to put on a 26-hour train ride? Are you willing to cut out some conferences? Are you willing to allow your students to travel through train, even though that means you need to take 3 extra days out of your academic year in order for them to travel? This is something that I put out to the people that are listening to us today. And like I said, encourage them to write to us through through any of Canny's social media. And then to you, Savo and Samia, very briefly, because we do not have much time, I would like to end on a positive note, because as you have both highlighted, this is a tough topic to be speaking. So I would like to ask you, give us one example or just something that makes you hopeful when it comes to this sort of topic and it comes to sustainability. What makes you hopeful moving forward?
If I can go first, I think just a few things are making me hopeful. Politicians are not making me hopeful. Business leaders are not making me hopeful. Most of them, most definitely. Young people are making me hopeful because more and more young people are doing a lot to campaign and call the powerful out for what they have done and what they are doing or what they're not doing to the environment. What also makes me hopeful is that networks such as Canny exist. This is very new, and the work and the research and the advocacy that Canny is doing, and giving us a platform to talk about this, this becoming an issue, this becoming a topic that we're dealing with and considering, is what gives me hope. And I'm just asking all of us to do more. Yes, what we're doing here, looking at the conferences and the flying and everything else, is very important. But I want us to ask important and uncomfortable questions about knowledge, power, coloniality, whose voices count and whose voices are being sidelined in our curriculum, in our work, and fight that, and fight for the plurality of knowledges, and for epistemic decolonization. That's where we might have a chance to make it.
Perhaps I can just briefly add to that. I agree with everything that has been said by Savo. And I think I want to just share something that very briefly that was shared with us at AISA at a recent event that we hosted to celebrate International Women's Day. And the topic, theme of this year's International Women's Day is embrace equity. And so I think what we discussed there in the context of gender equality and women's rights is just as relevant to the conversation that we've had today. And we had a keynote by Professor Lanitra Berger, who is the president and board chair of NAFSA, which is our US-American sister organization. And she gave us a little how-to guide. And that's what I would like to share with you as a parting message, if you will, just an ABC. A stands for acknowledge inequality and inequities. Start from the assumption that they exist, try to find out more about them. B is be woke and stay woke. Which means, that really speaks to our responsibility to keep abreast of developments, to dig deeper into issues. And then C is commit to action. And I think this is something that we can all do as individuals, and we can, collectively also bring about change in our institutions, in our countries, and ultimately, hopefully, for global society. Thank you.
Thank you both. It was such a pleasure and an honor to have you here today. And yes, thank you also for the final insights. I agree with you. Communication will be key, and having these difficult conversations might bring us a step closer. So again, thank you very much, Savo, Samia, and thank you all for being here. I am giving the word back to Kelly, our Canny and podcast coordinator. Thank you so much also, Kelly, for all your work in Canny.
Well, big thank you to Mawish, who is hiding on here on the screen. She's the one who coordinated this event, and so we would not be here without her for sure. So thank you, Mawish. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for this live podcast event during Canny Climate Action Week. Many thanks to our Canny co-host and our two guests for a truly fantastic conversation, for bringing up and asking these really tough questions and addressing them head on. These questions we really need to be considering. You orchestrated this absolutely beautifully, and it was just really empowering and wonderful. So thank you so much. Just quick reminders, the last Canny Action Week event is tomorrow, the Europe chapter meeting, and you can find more about that online at canny.org. Please tell us what you thought of the event through the link that Ine kindly added in the chat earlier. We definitely appreciate your feedback. It helps us further build on and improve for future Canny events. And if you want to be part of making the podcast, we are having those 2 meetings that are happening on May 2nd to accommodate different time zones. So definitely keep an eye on LinkedIn and whatnot to check those out. And I think we have those links in the chat as well if you want to register for them. And finally, this episode will be up on podcasting platforms such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on YouTube in a few weeks in May. I know I'm going to listen to it again, maybe even several times, just to really let it sink in, get all those tidbits of information. And I'm also going to share it widely because I think that there are a lot of people who will want to and also will benefit from hearing what was said on this episode today. There's just a lot of good stuff in the last hour or so. Plenty of fuel for taking action for a more just practice of internationalization, I think. So thank you everyone for joining the Canny Climate Dialogues and Canny Climate Action Week. And I wish you all a great rest of your day. Take care.